Welcome to the Smith Publicity All Things Book Marketing Podcast, offering tips, insights, and advice from the best in the publishing industry.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of All Things Book Marketing. I'm your host, Olivia McCoy, and our special guest today is Traci DeForge, founder of Produce Your Podcast. Welcome back, Traci.
Well, thank you so much, Olivia. I'm excited to be back. It's always so flattering when you get to do an encore performance on or an encore interview on someone's podcast. It's very flattering. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
You joined us in 2022 was the last time that we chatted, and we kind of discussed why authors should consider a podcast. So I'm super excited to have you back to discuss the nitty-gritty of running a podcast. And now that I have more experience with it, we're just going to have a great conversation about all the nerdy, geeky stuff that goes into behind the scenes.
Yes, and all the respect to you for managing all the details of the podcast. We were talking before we joined into the recording about everything that you're doing for your show, and I just think that's amazing. And so happy to dig in.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's start with what you do and how you help authors and experts.
Oh, well, thank you for asking. So Produce Your Podcast is a full service production, marketing, and distribution agency. That's very fancy for that. We basically help specifically business owners, coaches, consultants, authors launch a podcast. And then once the podcast is launched, we have all different types of services that help you maintain the podcast, grow the podcast, and even monetize the podcast through sponsorships and marketing your own products and services. So when we say full service, we approach the podcasting process 360 degree holistically and with a very strong emphasis on business development. So making sure that you're using the podcast to grow your business and your personal brand and sell your products and services.
And we discussed it on the last episode. Let's give a little bit recap of why our authors should be considering a podcast.
Well, the great thing about 2 years later is that it was a nice to have, and I feel like at that point it was like, take my word for it. You really should do this to increase your book sales and your personal brand and your visibility and all of those things. Now, 2 years later, as we're having this conversation, it's no longer a nice to have, it's a need to have. And it's not just take my word for it. It's just basically look around to your right and to your left, and you'll see how impactful podcasting has been for business development, but also for the ability to share your voice in a way that comes off the page, right? So especially for authors, the whole connection point around authenticity and visibility comes so close to home back to your voice, right? So if you're using a book for subject matter expertise, for example, if you're leveraging the interest in getting on more stages, we often say, and in your business, I'm sure you'll agree, that podcasts are the new speakers bureau, because if you're not promoting your podcast on LinkedIn and you want to be speaking on stages, then you need to start doing that. Like right now, put this podcast on pause, go add host a podcast to your LinkedIn profile, and then come back. That's how important a podcast has become as a visibility tool, a lead generation tool, and just an overall brand building foundational pillar, if you will.
The Smith Publicity team, in our meetings where we get together and talk about what's hot in publicity right now, podcasts have been one of the biggest points of conversation for at least the last year, but especially it feels like the last 6-9 months. It feels like that is a huge part of every publicity campaign we have going on right now. Audio content has just boomed, and I feel like that's probably also because of this going back to the office that we're seeing with more and more workplaces. So more and more people are commuting, which means more and more people are listening instead of reading your content. So like you were saying, great for discoverability, great for reach, great for visibility of your content, and then just more to promote.
Sure. Well, an interesting point about what you just said that I want to highlight is that it is there, in fact, I saw yesterday in a press release that the remote work, like the higher paying jobs in remote work, they went down from 10% to 2%. So the back to office and back to our regular routines, including commuting and listening to podcasts is absolutely a factor. The other thing that's an interesting component to the new reliance on audio, if you will, is that distinguishing opportunity to detect what's real versus what's not real. So the AI, and initially in our industry, especially, the AI started to send some ripple effects of fear. Like I even have a little bit of chills even saying this. But what's come to fruition is that the introduction of AI into all of our lives has actually pushed people into audio and connecting with audio, because it's, even though there is the ability to replicate voices in AI, which we're hearing about in lawsuits and all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, the genuineness of you being able to share your expertise and your voice and your thoughts and the impact that you can make with your storytelling, people are using it as a discernment tool to evaluate even whether or not to do business with you, because they can hear you. They can, if you're on video, they can see you. Like, it's like, oh, okay, this isn't an AI generated thing. This is a human who has real intellect and real expertise. So in our industry, I'm like, hey, you break it on, because the more artificial intelligence infiltrates print and that area of our world, the more people are going to turn to and have been turning to people who are using their voices.
That is an incredible point. I'm so glad you mentioned that. Feels like a lot of these conversations that I'm having nowadays can't exclude AI. It's just changed so much of what we do and why and how we do it. And with that, let's dive into the how. Let's start with the most valuable resource, the one that every leader, executive, expert, authority, author is really safeguarding is time. So let's talk about how much time it takes to run a podcast, produce a podcast, all of that.
Right. So time is money. So before I get into the actual like granular aspect of that answer, what I want to do is go one layer up 10,000 feet to say that it is the most efficient content creation tool that you could possibly have in your toolkit. Because in terms of time, if you show up like we're showing up today and you record one episode, which we're doing today, then that episode becomes a piece of content that can be released. If it's recorded in audio and video, then you have an audio recording, you have a video recording, then you have audio promos, you have video promos, then you have a transcription of which you can take that transcription, create social media posts, create blog posts, write articles for LinkedIn newsletters. You can use it for Q&A on social media. There's so many possibilities of the content repurposing that extends from one episode. So in terms of time, yes, producing and running and managing your own show does take an investment of your time. But as you're doing that, think about how much time you're actually really saving and not having to generate all of that content every single time. And if you release a podcast every week or every other week, then you have enough content for a month, for 2 weeks, for a month, for even longer than that from the written extension pieces of it. So yes, it does take time. And I do want to answer that question, but I really wanted to frame it that you're really saving time and you're swapping money for time because you're not having to really spend a lot of time and resources and bandwidth creating all these individual pieces of content. So with that being said, how much time does it take? Okay. So you have multiple options. You can go the full do-it-yourself indie podcaster pathway. Yes. And that is 100% completely okay. And I am an executive producer of multiple podcasts and run a full service podcast agency. I do not want to discourage anyone from jumping in and starting their own podcast. Like that is the biggest thing. I get asked a lot. It's like, if you have one piece of advice, what is it? And my advice is start where you are, but get started. So if you don't have the budget or the resources, or you just want to have fun and create it on your own initially, especially, then you just want to start. And by starting, you're in terms of time investing. So you're going to actually obviously have the time invested in the actual recording of the episodes themselves. You're also going to need to invest time in planning out your editorial content calendar. And if you have a co-host, then you're going to want to collaborate with them. If you don't have a co-host, then you're going to look at having other guests so you're not doing everything solo. But there's still power in just solo episodes, right? So I just want to get down to the nitty-gritty. Like, the most important thing for you to do is just get started, and how you then go from there. So if you edit on your own, this is the part where I do have to stand on two sides of a fence, because editing can be incredibly time consuming. And if you don't know exactly what it is that you're getting into, you might be getting into a lot more time. And if you exchange your hourly rate for what you earn from consulting clients, or the time spent writing for producing more material, or all of those things, it may make more sense for you to delegate that out. Because even as recently in survey reports that came out in May 2024, is that good quality audio is still the most important thing to grow your show and to keep audiences engaged and keep coming back and share, and then also to share your show. So you just cannot minimize the level of importance in audio quality. So editing time versus delegation, that's an area I would love people to do sooner as opposed to later, whether you hire an independent freelancer or work with an agency like ours. It's just a really critical component not to be underestimated. And then the remaining time spent is, you could probably share more on it, is all the marketing and everything and getting it out there to the world.
When I started doing the podcast about 2.5 years ago, I was heavily editing the audio. I was removing every extra so, every I think, every I guess, anything like that. And it took me hours and hours and hours to remove all those pieces. And then finally someone told me, that's not how people talk though. They do say they do say and, they do go off and things like that. So why don't you leave that in, save yourself some time? And I was like, great point. So I save my time some time that way. If there's a mistake in the speech, it just means, to your point, human. It's an actual person.
We are human. We are not robots. Yes, we are not robots. And there's some great tools out there now. So even when we connected 2 years ago, the technology to make podcasting easier has just grown exponentially. So just to kind of give everyone sort of a baseline, when I started Producer Podcast in 2016, Zoom existed, but it was not on anyone's radar. It was like GoToMeetings or Zoom. Like, it had a brand, but nobody, the pandemic obviously blew Zoom up out of the water. But in 2016, there were no remote recording opportunities for broadcast quality capture. So our team honed a technology out of the UK and licensed it and brought it in. And we were one of the pioneers in remote recording with live engineers in the studio. We started doing that almost 10 years ago. Then fast forward, there were Zoom, obviously we kind of exploded during the pandemic, but then now there are some really amazing platforms called Riverside, Squadcast that was just purchased by Descript. And they are remote recording platforms that just give you a lot more flexibility with the quality of your audio, but they're easy interface, just like what we're using on Zoom. And then Descript, which ideally you'll probably link in the show notes. The great thing about that tool is that if you aren't an editor by trade, then you can actually upload your audio and video, and you can remove those filler words. Like, they have automatic filler word removal. So wouldn't that have been amazing when you were doing it? The amount of time it saves. Now, the technology is not perfect. It can clip it. It can do some wonky things while they're still advancing it and making it better. But just the amount of time it saves for an independent podcaster, and just they have the ability to enhance studio quality sound. There's so much more now than there were tools available than there were, when I started. And, in podcast years, we're like 100. So
when it comes to this podcast, the All Things Book Marketing Podcast by Smith Publicity, I don't do it entirely alone. So shout out to Elisa and Katie, who are a huge help in, like you said, turning it into content. Katie helps with the blog. Elisa helps turn the transcript into the blog. And then Katie posts it and does great things optimizing that way. But when it comes to booking, hosting, editing, and distributing, that is going to be mostly all me. And I would say it takes me anywhere between, including the recording and the booking, between 6 to 10 hours per episode. Would you say that's about right?
I would say you're a pro at it. I would say that is to be super realistic, I would say that that is the minimum amount of time that you would want to allocate per episode. And some of that is going to be dependent upon how many marketing assets do you create? How many, do you send out a follow-up email to each of your guests with pre-written social media posts and sharing information for them? Because the more likely you are to do that, the more likely they are to share your episode out. So a tip in that regard would be like making sure that even the image, the graphic image, if you update it and you include a headshot of them, or your audio promo has their voice in it, they're going to be more likely to share it out to their network, which is an advantage for you. So, but that's an extra step. I can't tell you how many podcasters I come across. We do a lot of podcast audits for people who maybe started their podcast on their own and it may have stagnated and they just want to be like, did I get this right? What can I do to unbottleneck it to grow it further? And one of the things that we find a lot are some of these identifiers that they're not communicating with their guests because they just get overwhelmed and it's like, okay, it's one more thing. It just gets put on the back burner. So I think that's where you really want to hone in on what's the most important part of this process for your time and making sure you have a checklist. I think having a checklist or using a project management system, I don't know how you guys do it, but like we could not live without Monday.com because we are managing so many different shows simultaneously, but everything in essence has a templated checklist. Even though all our shows are custom, the workflow is as templated as possible so that everybody can cross their T's and dot their I's. So yeah, that was a really long answer for a short question, but there's just so many variables that go into it. And I want people to have a solid, realistic expectation, but not be fearful of it, because you can do as little or as much as you want, and you can grow into this workflow and optimize it as you continue to get more comfortable with the process.
You're right. I have fully optimized my workflow. I've been doing it over 2 years now. So I have the graphics already pre-made, and it's really easy for me to go into Canva and switch out the headshot and the names. And then you will be getting an email from me, follow-up email with the links and the graphic for you to share after this episode.
Thank you. We will share it.
About that. But then I also have pre-made templated emails for following up, making sure that they're getting everything that they need, sending questions in advance, inviting people on the show. So all of that does help me to save time, as well as having a process down. And I do use AI to help develop the transcript. And then we have Elisa come in and turns it into this great blog post that kind of summarizes some of the main points. And then again, using the same graphic really helps, and the same kind of structure, and of course, changing it up individually for the episode. So I have optimized my time that way. So that's a great point, is that when I first started this, it took a lot more time than it's currently taking me. But before we go back into time, because I know that's something we could spend a full episode on, let's switch over to talking about equipment. Okay. Normally I have my whole setup. I have my speaker and my headphones and everything. I am working from home this week. So it's my home office with my little recording, my pods. But this is something that I've heard recommended, is having any kind of microphone is better than having no microphone at all. So what are your thoughts on equipment and requirements, recommendations?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think, I don't believe in coincidences. So I think it's a happy accident that you were having your setup today be remote from home, because we talk a lot about how podcasting is portable for the listener, but we don't talk a lot about how being a podcast host can also be a portable experience, because I think so many people, again, they're just learning that you don't actually have to go into a broadcast studio in your town where you live to record a podcast. Can you? Absolutely. Is it one of the most fun things ever? It is if you're Traci DeForge, but it's not that much fun for everybody. And again, about efficiency, like the most important thing is to have a setup that works for you and is efficient for you. Having a microphone is incredibly important. And it is, to your point, best to have one if you're guesting on podcast or if you're hosting your own podcast. the type of microphone, there are all different ranges of investments. The one thing I will say is that there are a couple of microphones that don't have the branding cachet that other microphones have that are far better microphones and are equally as cost effective. So one podcast mic that I really like to recommend for people who are first starting out is an Audio Technica 2100 mic, because that microphone has two opportunities for connection. You can have a USB, which most people know exactly what that is, that you can plug directly into your laptop. You could throw it in a carry-on. For all intents and purposes, you could throw it in a big purse if you carry a big purse, or in your, laptop bag. But having that mic to start out with, plugging that into USB is great. The reason why you want to invest in that mic specifically is because it also has what's called an XLR cable connection. And that's for when you go to your next level of audio quality and you want to implement an interface box. So there's an audio interface box option. It's called Scarlett. It's a Focusrite 2i2. You can plug the mic into the interface box, and then the interface box plugs in by USB into your computer. And that's going to up level your sound significantly, but it's not going to change your price point because you've already bought a mic that you can grow with. So if you buy, like, for example, a Blue Yeti, what I will say about Blue Yeti is they have done a really, really good job of marketing themselves. And I will leave it there. Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah.
But the Audio Technica gives you that USB portability, but then you can grow with it. Now, if you want to jump right in and you want to, and just for cost comparisons, you can get that Audio Technica mic on Amazon. I just recently referred someone to that mic and they had it on sale for like $49 or $79. Like, we're not talking about hundreds and hundreds of dollars, but we're talking about a good quality mic. And then secondarily, for our clients, when we do our sound checks and diagnostics and work with them to set up their home studios or office studios, we source the Rode Pod mic, and that's PODMIC. It's slightly more expensive than the Audio Technica, and it doesn't have the dual USB and the XLR. So that's going to be for you if you're like, okay, I want to go all in on this thing. I want a good mic that's affordable and an interface box. Those two are very compatible with each other. And then you can go all the way up to, if you want to get super extravagant, which I have mic envy over right now, is the Shure mic, which is, those are more in like the $450 to $500 ranges. And they're amazing, but they're basically like wearing the Rolex of the podcasting mic, right? Like you can get just as amazing of a recording through the Audio Technica, the Rode Pod mic. It's just, the Shure mic is just, it's luxurious. It's like your Louis Vuitton bag versus your Coach bag, right? Like, I mean, we'll just put it in girl logic.
That's fun. That's fun. And like I said, I think these are from 7-Eleven too. So you could be super, super low tech with it or really, really high tech. And I love the variety. We do use a full microphone. I believe we have a Zoom P4, which is not the same thing as Zoom, the platform we're recording.
Right.
We use them.
Yeah. And we, with your setup, it brings such a good point back home. We were talking about the portability aspect, but I mean, podcasters are humans. We go on vacation, we travel for work, we work remotely in a hybrid situation, home and office. We travel internationally. Like, so it's very important to give yourself permission and grace to have a setup that works for you so that you can be consistent, because the hands down most important thing about growing your podcast, which ultimately means growing your business and growing your brand and growing your products and services, it has to start with the consistency, is the showing up and releasing episodes consistently. So you don't want your setup to be something that hinders you from being able to do that. That's why I love that we are able to have this conversation today in real time, because people will be able to listen to this episode and they'll be able to hear my audio quality, and they're going to be able to hear yours. There may be a distinguishing difference, but it may be not enough for them to go, all right, yeah, I can do this thing. I've got wired headphones that came with my iPhone. I can do this.
Yes. And then one last question about podcasts before we start to wrap up, because I know we're running out of time. I wanted to talk to you about distribution. Now,
Yes.
we use Spreaker. I love Spreaker because it handles distribution to Spotify, it handles Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and then it also has a little form that we were able to embed on our website so you can listen to all the episodes directly there on the website and in our blog posts. But what are your opinions and preferences for distributing?
Right. So I think great question, because I think one of the most confusing things that's out there for podcasters that are starting out right now is confusion over a hosting platform. A lot of people don't know what it is, how to use, what is it used for? So if you think about, you have a URL that you get for your website, but then your website has to be hosted somewhere, right? So you might get your URL through GoDaddy, but you might need to host your website on Bluehost or another hosting provider. It's the same with podcasting, in that your RSS feed needs to be hosted on a platform so that it can be distributed to as many places as possible for you to find for people to find your show. So the decision around a hosting platform is important. There are free platforms. Spotify for podcasters is free, but you get what you pay for. And I'm really serious about this, not tongue in cheek, because you want to invest in a platform that has all the bells and whistles that you can afford, because it's going to save you time. It's going to save you energy. And it's also going to give you more opportunities for visibility. Spreaker is a great platform. They're owned by iHeart. So iHeart is very large now in the podcasting space, obviously because of their radio blueprint. We are also a fan of Captivate .fm, because they have a really good, solid technology to insert your own ads for your own products and services, which for the podcasters that we work with, which are primarily, again, business owners, authors, like who's listening to the show, we want you to be able to advertise your own products and services in your own podcast. And that platform makes that really easy and cost effective. But then there's also Libsyn, there's Blueberry, there's Simplecast, like there's Buzzsprout. And I don't want to confuse you, but give you too many options. But what you need to look at when you're making your decision is, of course, affordability. But then what are your expectations out of the platform? And they should be, how many platforms do you connect to directly, so I don't have to go manually do anything else, but upload just to one? And then 2, do they connect to social media platforms so you can auto post social media, more convenience? And 3, can I advertise my own products and services? Because you want to be able to monetize your podcast with your own network and your own products and services first before you go out to traditional sponsors, which we could have a whole nother episode on. But those are the criteria that you really want to evaluate, and just don't choose free, because you're ultimately going to have to, if you want to scale and grow your podcast, you're going to have to migrate to another hosting platform. And although technology has made that more user-friendly today than it has in years, it's still a risk of losing the downloads that you've already achieved and the followers that you've already created, and exporting your stats. It's like, just start with the one that's going to work for you for growth. Just like your mic. Start with the one that you can grow with. Same with your platform.
Perfect. I think that covers all the questions that I had. So let's wrap it up with how our listeners and watchers can learn more about you and how to get support from you.
Yes. So thank you for asking. So the very best way to find out more about our services and to get in touch with me personally is to go to produceyourpodcast.com. And you just have an amazing wealth of resources and information and fun shows that you can check out that we produce, kind of like the sampling of the wall behind me for those of you who are watching this versus listening to it. But if you want to see what I'm talking about, then you can just go to our website and check out our work. But produceyourpodcast.com is really it's our container for resources, tools, and tips and practices. And we just love to connect with you there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Traci. I'm so glad we got your encore episode.
I'm so glad I got to do an encore episode. Thank you so much. I look forward to the trifecta episode where we'll talk about monetization and sponsorship, because that is the next level of podcast growth right there. So I'll be back for that one.
Perfect. Sounds good to me. And listeners, watchers, if you like this episode, as always, don't forget to rate, review, subscribe, and share it with anyone else that might be interested. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Smith Publicity All Things Book Marketing Podcast. To reach us and learn about our many services, visit smithpublicity.com or send us an email to info@smithpublicity.com.